Okay, so get this. What if I told you there's this thing, right? It's called the yield curve, and it can practically predict the future.
Sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? But seriously, it's this economic indicator that's predicted, get this, the last 9 recessions.
It's true. The yield curve has an incredible track record. It's not magic or anything, though.
Yeah, what is it then? Some kind of economic crystal ball?
You could say it's more like the collective wisdom of investors, all their hopes and fears about the economy bundled into one handy little chart.
Okay, so walk us through it. What is this yield curve thing, and what does it tell us? And how does it even invert? I don't even know what that means.
All right, well, imagine for a sec you're lending money to a friend. Let's say $50.
Okay, so far so good.
Would you want more interest if they paid you back in a week? Or if they took, say, 5 years to pay you back?
5 years, for sure. More time, more risk. I need a little extra incentive to lend it out that long.
Exactly. That right there is the basic idea behind the yield curve. It's essentially a graph that tracks the interest rates on U.S. Treasury bonds, basically, loans to the government.
Okay, and usually those longer-term bonds, they offer a better return, right?
Right. Think of it like this. The government wants to borrow your money. If they're asking you to lock it up for a longer period, they need to sweeten the deal a bit with a higher interest rate. That's the normal, healthy state of things.
Makes sense. So where does the whole inverting thing come in?
So an inverted yield curve, that's when that normal relationship flips. It means investors are suddenly willing to accept a lower return on those long-term bonds, like the 10-year ones, compared to the short-term ones, like the 2-year.
So it's like they're saying, I'm not so sure about the long-term economic outlook. Better grab this lower rate now, just in case things go south.
You got it. It often signals a lack of confidence in future economic growth. And historically, that lack of confidence, it's a big red flag. You see that inverted curve, it's often a sign that a recession might be on the horizon.
Seriously, how often are we talking?
Get this, an inverted yield curve has preceded every major U.S. recession since 1950.
Wow, okay, so this isn't just theoretical, this is the real deal.
No kidding. And you know what? This actually happened fairly recently, back in August of 2019. Yeah, the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, it dropped down to 1.493%. Meanwhile, the 2-year note rate, that was actually higher at 1.533%. It was subtle, but it definitely raised some eyebrows.
So even back then, before, gestures broadly, everything that's happened since, investors were already picking up on something, like a feeling in the air.
Exactly. The yield curve is practically shouting, warning, warning. But those signals, it's like that old saying, a canary in a coal mine. They can be easy to miss until it's too late.
So that warning sign, that canary in the coal mine, it actually, it played out in a really visible way. Remember all those stories about stores closing, the whole retail apocalypse thing?
Right. Yeah, it's a perfect example of how those economic indicators, they connect to the real world right in front of us. And while online shopping is definitely a factor, our sources point to something even bigger, something a lot of folks are talking about these days, income inequality and this shrinking middle class.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just blaming Amazon then.
Way more nuanced. Remember those crazy stats from back in 2019?
Yeah, I think so. Refresh my memory.
Over 9,300 retail stores shut down that year.
Wow.
That's a 59% jump from the year before.
No kidding.
And it's not just, your mom and pop shops going under. We're talking big names, Payless, Gymboree, even Sears was struggling.
Oh, wow, Sears. I remember those stores. It really felt like every other week some big brand was going belly up.
It was a huge trend. And yeah, e-commerce is part of it, sure, but you can't ignore the impact of a shrinking middle class. As people feel that squeeze income inequality well, they have less money to spend, right? They cut back.
It's a domino effect, almost. Less spending, businesses suffer, and boom, empty storefronts.
Exactly. But, and here's what gets really interesting. While all those traditional retailers were closing, budget stores, they were booming.
Really? Like who?
Think Dollar General, Dollar Tree, opening new locations left and right.
Huh. That's fascinating. So even when times are tough, people still gotta shop. But they're looking for those bargains. You can practically see the economic divide playing out right there on the shelves.
It really is a powerful illustration. The rise of those budget-friendly options while other retailers struggle. It tells you a lot about consumer behavior and those growing pressures on the middle class.
So we've got these two separate stories running, right? The yield curve inverting, which feels kind of abstract, and then this real world struggle of these retail stores. How do they connect? What's the missing link?
Well, it's all interconnected. Remember that shrinking middle class we talked about? Less disposable income?
Right, right.
That leads to, consumers buying less demand,
Yeah.
and that slowdown in spending, that can trigger those big economic downturns, the kind that show up on, yep, you guessed it, the yield curve.
Wow. So it's like a feedback loop almost.
Exactly. It becomes self-reinforcing.
Man, that is sobering. Really drives home how those big economic forces, even the ones that seem really complicated, can have this ripple effect on, on all of us.
And we can't forget that. Behind those closed stores, behind the statistics, it's people.
Yeah.
People's lives, jobs lost, livelihoods disrupted. It's about more than just numbers. It's a human story.
It's true, It's easy to get lost in the weeds with all this economic jargon, but like you said, there are real people affected by this stuff. These aren't just numbers on a screen.
Absolutely.
So we've thrown a lot of info at our listeners today. What's the key takeaway here? What can we actually do with this information?
Well, the economy, it's a beast, right? Super complex. But getting a handle on these indicators, like that yield curve, or seeing those trends play out, like we talked about with retail, it helps us connect the dots. It's like you start to develop this intuition, this sense of where things might be headed.
It's like we're all amateur economists now.
Huh. In a way, yeah.
But seriously, it feels good to be able to, at least try to decode those financial news headlines.
Exactly. And that knowledge, it empowers you. Whether it's about your own money, investments, or just understanding those bigger forces at play in your community.
So next time you hear about the yield curve inverting, and trust me, you'll start to notice it now, take a look around.
See what's happening in your own backyard.
Exactly. Are those budget stores popping up like crazy?
Are those familiar brands struggling? It might be a sign of things to come.
It's all connected.
Like we've been saying, Wall Street and Main Street. Two sides of the same coin.
So to wrap this up, it's not enough to just memorize the definition of a yield curve, right?
It's about the bigger picture.
It's about taking those abstract financial signals and connecting them to what's actually happening in the real world. Like with those stores closing, it's about becoming more aware, more informed.
And hopefully a little more empowered to weather those economic storms.
Well said. Now, before we go, a final thought to ponder. We talked about the retail landscape as this kind of mirror to the economy. So I gotta ask, what does your local shopping mall say about the future? What changes are all you seeing in your community? Something to think about. Until next time.